The air inside the lawyer's office smelled faintly of leather and dust, the kind of scent that carried both history and judgment. Heavy curtains shut out the bright afternoon sun, leaving the room dim, like a stage set for a performance nobody wanted to attend. James Walker sat at the long oak table, his uniform pressed neatly as always, though he wasn't here as a soldier. Today he was a grandson waiting for the final words of the man who had shaped much of his childhood. Across from him, Sophia crossed her legs with the elegance of someone accustomed to being watched. At 35, she radiated the polished confidence that came from years of curated appearances and carefully chosen company. Her manicured nails tapped against the armrest, her smile perfectly measured, as if she already knew the outcome of this gathering. To her, inheritance was not a mystery but a confirmation of what she believed she deserved. The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading. The cadence was slow, deliberate as he listed properties, accounts, and assets. Sophia's name surfaced again and again. 3 houses, a vineyard in California, generous shares in an investment portfolio. Each mention tightened the smirk on her face, until it looked less like joy and more like triumph. Then came James's turn. To my grandson James Walker, the lawyer read, I leave the garage on my property and its contents. Silence hung for a beat too long. Sophia leaned back, laughter slipping through her lips like a blade. The garage, she said loud enough for the cousins in the back to hear. All that service to the country and he gets a shed full of rust. A couple of relatives chuckled nervously, eager to stay in her favor. James's jaw tightened but his face remained neutral. Years in the army had taught him that silence could be sharper than any retort. He signed where required, said nothing and rose from his seat. Outside, the autumn air hit him like a clean slap, sharp and bracing. His sister's laughter still echoed behind him but he did not turn back. For Sophia the garage was nothing but junk. For James it was something else entirely, a puzzle, perhaps even a message. And as he walked down the gravel path toward the far edge of the estate, he could not shake the feeling that the old wooden building was waiting for him. The gravel crunched beneath James's boots as he followed the winding path to the far edge of the property. The main house faded behind him, its polished windows reflecting Sophia's world of wealth and appearances. Ahead stood the garage, leaning slightly, its paint blistered from decades of weather, the tin roof dented by storms long past. To anyone else it looked like a relic ready to collapse. But to James it was familiar, almost alive, like an old comrade waiting silently for his return. As he approached, his eyes caught a piece of paper taped to the wooden door. The edges had curled with time, but the handwriting was unmistakable. His grandfather's careful block letters, steady and deliberate. James reached up, his fingers brushing the note as if it might dissolve into dust. This garage is my final test. Only a true soldier will know what to do. The words rooted him to the spot. Yes. Not an inheritance, not a consolation prize, but something intentional, crafted for him alone. His throat tightened as memory surged. Summer afternoons spent crouched on this very concrete floor, holding a wrench too big for his small hands while his grandfather guided him patiently. He could still hear the old man's voice. A soldier isn't just about fighting battles, James. It's about fixing what's broken, even when nobody thanks you for it. Those lessons had carried him through long nights overseas, when engines failed, when supplies ran thin, when silence was more dangerous than noise. The wind rattled the garage door as if urging him forward. James exhaled slowly and gripped the handle. The hinges groaned in protest, releasing a faint scent of motor oil, soap, and rusted steel. A single sliver of sunlight cut through a gap in the roof, illuminating the shadowed interior like a spotlight. His pulse quickened. Whatever lay beyond this threshold, it wasn't junk. It was a message, maybe even a challenge. And deep down, James knew, his grandfather was still speaking to him. The door groaned wider as James stepped inside, and for a moment the world outside seemed to vanish. The garage was still and heavy with the scent of old motor oil, soap, and faint rust. Dust swirled in the narrow beam of sunlight streaming through a crack in the roof, giving the air a suspended, almost sacred weight. Every tool, every shadow seemed to whisper with memory. His boots crunched softly against the concrete floor. He paused, letting his eyes adjust, scanning the room as if it were foreign terrain. The familiar outlines emerged, shelves sagging under jars of bolts and screws, a workbench marked with stains from decades of repairs, and an old radio resting silently in the corner. It was exactly as he remembered, yet now it felt different, as though every object had been deliberately left for him to find. That was when he saw it. On the floor near the workbench, half bathed in the slant of light, sat a steel box. Its surface was scratched but not rusted, sturdy despite the years. James crouched down slowly, the weight of the moment pressing on him. Beside the box leaned a faded photograph in a simple frame. His breath caught. It was him, 10 years old, grinning beneath the weight of his grandfather's oversized army jacket, a wrench nearly as long as his arm clutched in both hands. His grandfather stood behind him, one hand steady on his shoulder, the other pointing at some unseen task. James touched the glass, leaving a streak through the dust, and a warmth spread in his chest, mingled with an ache. Pinned above the workbench was another note, the handwriting shaky but still his grandfather's. James read the words slowly, feeling each one land with deliberate weight. Inside this box lies your true test. Do not rush. Patience will guide you. Only when you are ready should you open it. James's hand hovered over the latch of the steel box, but something in him, instinct, training, maybe both, told him to stop. His grandfather had chosen his words carefully, and rushing would mean failure before the test had even begun. He stepped back, his eyes never leaving the box. The silence of the garage pressed in around him, but it wasn't empty, it was expectant. His grandfather had left him something more than steel and tools. He had left him a trial, one that demanded not strength but restraint. And James, standing in the half-light of the garage, realized that the test had already started. The garage always smelled the same in summer: warm oil, sawdust, and the faint tang of metal. To James it was the scent of home. While the other neighborhood kids sped past on bikes or shouted over video games, he sat cross-legged on the cool concrete floor, watching his grandfather's hands move with quiet precision. "Check every bolt," his grandfather would say, leaning over the open hood of a truck. "Don't trust the shine. A clean surface can hide a crack." James never forgot the way those words sounded. Measured, steady, not just about machines but about life itself. The afternoons stretched endlessly in those years, sunlight spilling in through the open doors, dust swirling like tiny sparks in the air. James learned patience there, not as a rule but as a rhythm. His grandfather never rushed a repair. If a bolt resisted, he didn't force it, he coaxed it free. If a part looked fine, he checked it twice anyway. Every movement was deliberate, every silence instructive. Sophia, 3 years older and already chasing the approval of anyone who might give it, never stayed long. Sometimes she would stand in the doorway, her hair perfectly brushed even on sweltering days, smirking at the grease that streaked James's arms. "Why do you waste time in here?" she had once asked, her voice sharp with the certainty of a teenager. "After Grandpa's gone, all of this will be mine anyway. You can have the garage if you want. It's just junk." James remembered the way his grandfather had stilled at those words. He didn't look up, didn't raise his voice. He simply tightened the last bolt and said quietly, "Careful, Sophia. Not everything worth keeping shines." Sophia had rolled her eyes and walked away, muttering something under her breath. James hadn't understood the weight of that moment back then. But now, standing years later in the same space, those words came back to him like a commandment carved in steel. In that garage he hadn't just learned how to fix engines. He had learned how to see beneath the surface, how to trust patience over force, and how to listen for truths hidden in silence. His grandfather's lessons had been disguised as mechanical training, but James knew better now. The garage had always been more than a workshop. It had been a classroom. And he had been the only student willing to stay. As the years passed, the distance between James and Sophia grew wider than the gravel path that divided the family home from the garage. At first it was the simple drift of childhood. Different interests, different friends. But with time the split hardened into something more permanent. Sophia had a natural gift for charm. By the time she was 15 she knew exactly how to tilt her head, how to laugh at just the right pitch, how to say what adults wanted to hear. Teachers praised her confidence, neighbors admired her beauty, and friends followed wherever she led. Prom nights, school plays, college parties, her life sparkled with moments that looked perfect from the outside. James, meanwhile, preferred the quiet order of the garage. While Sophia mastered the art of appearances, he mastered the art of listening. To the hum of an engine, to the creak of a wrench, to the unspoken weight in his grandfather's silence. When the time came, it felt natural for him to join the army at 18. The discipline, the structure, the demand for patience and precision, it was the closest thing he had ever found to the lessons of the garage. Sophia had scoffed at his decision. Running away to play soldier, she'd said with a half-smile, as if his path were a childish fantasy. To her, the military meant grime, danger, and sacrifice. Things that didn't photograph well, things that couldn't be sold at a business dinner or spun into a story of personal triumph. Their lives diverged like two roads that once ran parallel but slowly bent away from each other. Sophia climbed through the social and business world, always in the center of a crowd, always polished, always admired. James crossed deserts, jungles, and bases, serving in silence, his clarity sharpened by hardship and distance. Yet no matter where the army sent him, one place remained constant in his memory: the garage. When the noise of deployment grew too heavy, he would close his eyes and see the tools hanging in perfect rows, hear the calm sound of his grandfather's voice reminding him to check every bolt. The garage grounded him, gave him purpose when everything else threatened to unravel. For Sophia, the garage had always been a symbol of insignificance, a corner of life she could dismiss with a laugh. For James, it was the anchor that steadied him against the storms of both war and family. And though neither of them admitted it aloud, the garage had already chosen between them. It was one of those late summer afternoons when the light softened into gold, painting long shadows across the garage floor. James remembered it clearly because his grandfather had turned off the radio, a rare silence in a place usually filled with the low murmur of country songs and farm reports. The sudden hush made James look up from the engine he was helping with. "Close the door, son," his grandfather had said. His voice carried a weight that made James obey without question. The heavy wooden door shut with a final click, sealing them into a world that felt separate from everything else. His grandfather reached into the breast pocket of his worn work jacket and pulled out a small brass key. It wasn't shiny, its edges were smooth from use and a faint trace of grease stained the ridges. He set it gently in James's palm and closed his hand around it. "When I'm gone," the old man said, his eyes steady and unreadable, "you'll know what to do with this. For the right person, the garage will speak. For the wrong person," he let the pause hang heavy and deliberate, "it's just a shed." James had studied the key that day, turning it over between his fingers. It didn't look extraordinary. Could have opened a lockbox, a drawer, maybe even an old cabinet. But the way his grandfather handed it to him, like passing down a family crest, like entrusting a secret, made James feel the gravity of it even if he didn't yet understand. He had tried to ask what it unlocked, but his grandfather only shook his head with a faint smile. "Timing matters," he said. "Force breaks what patience can open." Then, as if the moment had never happened, he returned to the engine, his hands moving with the same practiced calm as always. Now, years later, standing in the dim light of the garage, James could still feel the weight of that small key pressing into his palm. He reached into his pocket and touched it, the brass warm against his skin. His grandfather's words echoed inside him like a riddle waiting to be solved. "For the right person, the garage will speak." James swallowed hard. The question was no longer if the garage would speak, but when. The box sat where he had left it, squat and patient on the garage floor. For days James had circled around it, resisting the pull to pry it open. His grandfather's note had warned him not to rush, and discipline had kept him in check. But that morning, the weight of the brass key in his pocket felt heavier than usual, as though it had been waiting for this moment. James knelt down, brushed a thin layer of dust from the lid and slid the key into the latch. It fit perfectly. A soft click followed, not loud but final, like a door opening onto something long sealed away. The lid creaked as he raised it, and inside lay a neat arrangement that spoke of his grandfather's careful hand. First, a small bundle of keys bound together with twine. Each carried a tag stamped with letters. North Bench, Lift, Bay, Trunk. One key, darker than the rest, had no label at all. James lifted it, felt its strange weight, and set it carefully back. Beside the keys rested a photograph, its colors faded but still vibrant enough to stir recognition. A Shelby GT 500, deep blue with twin pale racing stripes, gleamed in the sunlight of a long-ago summer. James's pulse quickened. He knew that driveway, that leaning mailbox, that maple tree casting a crooked shadow. It was his grandfather's car, the one James had only ever seen under a tarp, too precious to drive, too powerful to forget. Underneath the photograph lay a sealed envelope. His name stretched across the front in deliberate handwriting. James. Not Jimmy, not Kid, not any of the affectionate nicknames his grandfather once used. This was formal, intentional. James broke the twine carefully, the way he had been taught to loosen a stubborn bolt. With steady pressure, never force. Inside was a single page. His grandfather's handwriting was slower now, but still strong. If you are reading this, you have already passed the first step. Do not rush. Look where the light falls in late morning. Trust the map we drew together. The right key will feel right in your hand. Never force what patience will reveal. James let the paper rest on his knees. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice in the rhythm of the words, patient and steady. His gaze drifted toward the high window where a shaft of sunlight angled across the workbench. His grandfather had known the light would land there at this hour. He had planned it all. James folded the note back into the envelope, then closed the lid of the steel box. The test was unfolding step by step, not through riddles but through rituals. And the voice of his grandfather, though gone, was still guiding him as surely as if he were standing beside him. The first call came just after dawn. James ignored it, thinking it was nothing more than routine business or a wrong number. But then the phone rang again. And again. By the third time he glanced at the screen. By noon the counter had climbed past 20. Calls came in relentless waves. Sometimes two within minutes, sometimes stretched just far enough apart to keep him from forgetting. James let them all roll into voicemail, each one stacking on top of the last like papers tossed onto a desk in disarray. When curiosity finally got the better of him, he played a few of them back. The tone shifted wildly, as though his sister were throwing every possible tactic at him, searching for the one that might crack his silence. James, don't be foolish. One message began, her voice dripping with condescension. It's a garage. You don't know what you're doing. Hand it over and I'll make sure you're taken care of. The next message was softer, syrupy with regret. I was wrong. I laughed, but I didn't mean it. We can work together on this. Just, please call me back. By the fifth voicemail, her patience had snapped. You think this is a joke? The garage is part of the estate. You can't just lock me out. If you don't answer, I'll find a way around you. James listened to each message only once, then saved them to a folder labeled Garage Test. He made notes in a small green notebook, recording the date, time, and tone of every call. The army had taught him that pressure could distort memory, that details mattered more than emotions when the stakes were high. Facts were his shield, and he intended to keep them sharp. By nightfall, the counter stood at 52 missed calls. His phone buzzed like a wasp trapped in a jar, but James kept it face down on the workbench. He didn't answer. He didn't respond. He didn't even allow himself the satisfaction of imagining her frustration. Instead, he poured a cup of coffee, sat in the stillness of the garage, and let the buzzing fade into the background. Sophia's desperation was loud, frantic, uneven. The garage, in contrast, spoke in silence, steady and patient. James knew which voice to trust. The storm of calls dragged James's thoughts backward, toward the one time he had trusted Sophia when he shouldn't have. It had been just after his first deployment. His knee was still stiff from a training injury, and the doctors had ordered him into physical therapy near the VA clinic. He needed a place to stay, simple short-term month to month. Nothing more than 4 walls and a working heater. Sophia had swept in with her usual charm. She wore a champagne-colored scarf that winter, the kind that looked more like decoration than warmth. "Let me handle it," she said, linking her arm through his as if the decision were already made. Family discount, of course. You've served your country, James. You deserve better than some run-down motel. She drove him to a spotless condo that looked more like a showroom than a home. Bowls of fake lemons sat on the counter, and a candle burned in the kitchen that smelled like hotel linens. Perfect, isn't it? She said, flashing that polished smile. And it's through my company, so you'll be in good hands. James had wanted to trust her. He was tired, his knee ached, and the thought of arguing wore him down more than the deployment ever had. He signed the stack of papers she slid across the counter, barely noticing the fine print. The fees had been explained with the breezy ease of someone reciting a recipe. A screening fee, a cleaning retainer, a key fob deposit, an optional parking pass that was mandatory for security reasons. By the time James wired the first month's rent plus all the fees, most of his hazard pay was gone. Sophia hugged him on the way out the door, leaving a faint trace of citrus perfume on his jacket. "See," she said. "You're set." 2 weeks later, the eviction notice landed on his doorstep. A corporate renter had offered more, and the owner had taken it without hesitation. James called Sophia in disbelief. She was at a closing, her voice brisk and distracted. "Policy is policy," she said. "Don't worry, I'll get you a partial refund once accounting clears it." The refund never came. The partial vanished into deductions and line items that made no sense. What little returned wasn't enough to cover even a week in a motel near the clinic. James ended up sleeping on a friend's garage floor, his knee throbbing through the cold concrete nights. He hadn't yelled at her then. Instead, he'd opened a notebook and written every number, every fee, every missing dollar in straight columns, just as his grandfather had taught him to check every bolt. When he'd shown Sophia the list, she'd only tapped the bottom line and said, "This is how business works, James. You can't expect special treatment. Besides, I gave you the family rate." Now, standing in his grandfather's garage with Sophia's frantic voicemails piling up, James felt the memory settle over him like armor. He had been naive once, but not again. The woman calling him now wasn't desperate for reconciliation. She was desperate for control. And he would not hand it to her, not this time. James had learned long ago that confrontation was not always victory. In the army, charging blindly into noise was the fastest way to lose men. The wiser path was often silence. Watching, waiting, securing the perimeter before making a single move. And now, with Sophia's calls ringing like artillery fire in the background, he leaned on that same discipline. The first step was the garage itself. At dawn, James drove into town and bought a heavy-duty padlock, a set of shop rags and a new notebook. He changed the lock on the garage door with steady, deliberate motions, logging the serial number and the date in his notebook as if filing a field report. Then he mounted a small camera above the entrance and posted a simple sign, "Recording in progress." It wasn't drama, it was clarity. Anyone who approached would know the room was guarded. The second step was paper. At the county clerk's office, James requested certified copies of his grandfather's will and the property transfer. The clerk stamped them with thick blue seals, each page becoming another layer of armor. He filed a brief harassment report as well, not naming Sophia directly, but documenting the frequency and tone of the calls. Records win battles, he reminded himself. Emotions lose them. Next came the bank. James opened 2 accounts under a small LLC he had quickly registered in his name. One for operations, one as reserve. He insisted on dual authorization settings so no single transaction could drain the funds. The manager offered him a wealth advisor. James declined. "I don't need growth," he said. "I need clean trails." The manager gave him a curious look but complied. At home, he hardened his digital defenses. New phone number, fresh email accounts, 2-factor authentication with physical keys, and encrypted storage for backups. He printed a 1-page recovery plan, folded it neatly and sealed it inside a freezer bag, tucking it in the back of his refrigerator like an old field trick. Each action was small, almost invisible, but together they formed a shield. Sophia might laugh, she might plead, she might threaten, but James knew that noise was only surface. Underneath there was always a crack. His job was to make sure his side had none. That evening he brewed a pot of coffee and sat in the garage with the steel box on the workbench. The phone buzzed again in his pocket, vibrating like a trapped insect. He didn't answer. He didn't even look. Instead, he placed both palms on the wood grain of the bench and whispered the line his grandfather had repeated 1,000 times. Try patience first. The garage seemed to approve, its silence steady and unbroken. James exhaled slowly. Confrontation would come, but it would come on his terms, not Sophia's. Until then, he would do the work, document the facts, and let silence speak louder than her noise. The rain had just started when James pushed open the glass door to the law office. The old brick building sat quietly on Main Street, its gold-lettered windows dulled by time. Inside, the air smelled of paper and polish. The receptionist, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, nodded him toward the back where a door already stood open. Grant Avery rose from behind his desk. His hair was thinner, his back slightly stooped, but his handshake still carried the firmness of a man who had once led soldiers. He had been James's grandfather's lawyer for decades, but before that he had been his crew chief in the service. Their bond was forged in grease, fire, and silence, the kind of friendship that didn't fade. "Sit," Avery said, motioning toward a chair across from his desk. He pulled a thick folder from a drawer and set it carefully on the blotter. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a man tightening bolts he knew could never be loose. "I read your grandfather's will again last night," Avery began. "It's clean. Watertight. Every signature in place, every witness verified. There's no opening for dispute. Not without perjury." James let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief was there, but so was suspicion. If the will was airtight, why was Sophia so desperate? Avery leaned back, studying him with the same look he must have given fresh recruits decades ago. Measuring, weighing, deciding what they could handle. Finally, he said, "There's something else you should know." James straightened. "The garage," Avery continued, "isn't just a place with tools and a lift. Your grandfather kept contracts there. Real ones. Defense subcontracting agreements. Long-term supply deals still active and pulling in millions." The words landed like a steel weight on James's chest. "You're saying—" "I'm saying the name on those contracts isn't Sophia's. It's yours now." Avery's voice didn't waver. "That makes you more than an heir. You're a stakeholder. You inherit the rights, the obligations, and the protection those agreements carry." James sat back stunned. He had expected secrets, maybe some family mementos hidden away, but not this. Not contracts tied to federal law. Not something that turned a dusty garage into a vault of national significance. Avery tapped the folder with 2 fingers, steady as a drumbeat. "If anyone tampers with your property, physical or intellectual, it's not just theft. It's interference with a government asset. The consequences are federal. And binding." The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the desk lamp. James thought of Sophia's frantic calls, her threats, her sudden swing from arrogance to pleading. Now he understood. She had laughed at the garage, but when she realized what it truly contained, her desperation had consumed her. Avery slid a business card across the desk. "That's my direct line. Updated as of this morning. If anything happens, anything, you call me first." His eyes softened then, just for a moment. "Your grandfather wasn't paranoid, James. He was preparing you for a fight he knew was coming." James picked up the card. The paper felt heavier than it should, like it carried more than numbers and ink. It carried a shield. When he stepped back out into the rain, the world felt sharper, clearer. The garage was no longer just a family inheritance. It was a battlefield, and he had just been handed command. James sat at the oak desk in Grant Avery's law office, the weight of his grandfather's legacy pressing firmly on his shoulders. For the first time he realized the garage was not simply an old shed filled with tools and memories. It was a command post, a living trust of responsibility. With Grant's guidance, James filed the necessary documents: banking protections, ownership records, and the registration of a limited liability company under his name. Each stamped page felt like a layer of armor, wrapping the garage in a shield that no lawsuit or greedy sibling could penetrate. The process was not glamorous. It was hours of forms, signatures, and legal jargon, But James approached it with the same discipline his grandfather had taught him when repairing engines. Steady hands, no shortcuts, and patience for every detail. When Grant finally looked up from the final document and said, "It's secure now. No one can touch it without facing federal law," James felt a rare calmness spread through him. That night he walked back into the garage and set the steel box on the workbench. The air smelled faintly of oil and dust, but also of promise. For the first time, the space no longer felt like an inheritance he had to defend. It was a duty he had chosen to carry. The garage was his, but more importantly, it was his responsibility to protect and to use wisely. Shielded by law, it had become more than a gift. It was a legacy made unbreakable. The transformation began quietly. James cleared out the garage one weekend at a time, scrubbing away years of dust and reorganizing the tools his grandfather had once handled with care. The steel box still sat on the workbench as a silent reminder of why he was doing this. Not for profit, not for pride, but for service. With the help of Grant Avery and a few fellow veterans, James filed for nonprofit status. Soon, word spread through the local veteran community. The Walker Garage would be a place where service members and their families could bring their cars for repairs, free of charge or at cost, no questions asked. At first, only a handful of men and women showed up. Old friends from the base, widows of fallen soldiers, and young recruits struggling to keep their beat-up trucks running. But within weeks, the garage buzzed with life. Volunteers offered their hands, local businesses donated parts, and neighbors stopped by with coffee and sandwiches for the workers. Every tool turned, every story shared under that roof stitched the community a little closer together. The Shelby GT500, once just a photograph in the steel box, became the centerpiece of the garage. Restored piece by piece, it wasn't displayed as a trophy but as a symbol. James kept it polished, not for the shine, but because his grandfather had taught him that trust, like an engine, must be maintained with care. When veterans touched the car, many whispered their thanks, as if the Shelby itself carried the spirit of the man who had left them this legacy. For James, the garage was no longer just a shield of law. It had become a sanctuary of service, living proof that his grandfather's lessons still had the power to mend lives. The headlines hit like a thunderclap. Walker Realty under investigation. Overnight, Sophia's carefully constructed empire began to crumble. What had once been praised as a model of success, a glittering portfolio of properties and a polished public image, was now dissected piece by piece on every news channel. Former clients stepped forward, their voices sharp with betrayal, recounting stories of inflated contracts, hidden fees, and homes sold under false promises. Employees who had once smiled in her shadow now revealed the bullying, the lies, and the exploitation behind the glossy advertisements. Sophia tried to hold her composure. She released statements through her lawyers, insisting she was the victim of misunderstandings, that the accusations were exaggerations fueled by envy. But the more she spoke, the faster the tide turned against her. Cameras followed her from courthouse steps to her office doors, flashing relentlessly, capturing the cracks in her perfect image. The woman who once mocked James for inheriting junk, now found herself mocked in headlines, her name tangled with words like fraud, predatory, and criminal charges. For James, the fall of his sister was not a victory. He watched the reports in silence, seated in the same garage where his grandfather had once taught him to measure strength by patience, not by power. He felt no joy in her downfall, only a quiet recognition that choices have consequences. While the veteran's garage thrived, Sophia's empire collapsed under the weight of her own greed. The contrast was stark. One legacy built on service, the other on deception. And as the state filed charges against her, the truth was undeniable. Sophia had lost everything she once believed defined her. The envelope arrived on a gray morning, its paper thin, the ink smudged as though the words themselves carried the weight of shame. James turned it over in his hands, recognizing his sister's sharp handwriting. He hesitated before opening it, his instinct telling him that whatever lay inside would not change the past, but perhaps reveal the pieces of the sister he had once known. Inside, Sophia's letter was raw, stripped of the polished tone she once used in business and society. She admitted her greed, How envy had corroded her heart, how every success James found reminded her of her own insecurities. She confessed to guilt over manipulating him years ago, acknowledging that she had chosen ambition over family. And at the end her plea was simple. If you ever visit grandfather's grave, tell him I was wrong. Tell him I see it now, that the garage, the lessons, the patience, the honor, those were the treasures. Not the houses. Not the money. I was blind. James set the letter back into its envelope, his chest heavy with conflicting emotions. There was no triumph in her words, only sorrow, and for the first time in years he heard his sister's voice not as an enemy, but as someone finally broken open by truth. He placed the envelope into the steel box in the garage, beside his grandfather's letters and the photograph of the Shelby. For now he chose silence. No reply, no judgment, only the quiet act of preserving her words. One day when the time felt right he would carry them to his grandfather's grave. But not yet. The garage was quiet that evening, the kind of silence that wrapped itself around James like a blanket. He sat at the workbench, the steel box open before him, Sophia's letter resting on top of its contents. He read her words one last time, feeling the weight of her confession, the fragility of her handwriting. Then with steady hands he folded the letter and placed it inside the box, locking it away with the same care his grandfather once gave to tools after a long day's work. It was not an act of forgiveness nor of punishment, it was simply a choice for patience. James knew vengeance would only chain him to the bitterness that had already consumed his sister, and reconciliation forced too soon would ring hollow. Instead he chose the discipline his grandfather had always preached. Wait for the right time, trust the process, and never force what was not ready. As he closed the steel box, he whispered a quiet promise to himself. When he stood at his grandfather's grave, he would carry Sophia's words with him. Not as her redemption, but as truth spoken too late. That night, James sat in the Shelby, the engine idling softly, its hum echoing through the garage. He rested his hands on the steering wheel, staring into the darkness beyond the headlights. For the first time in months he felt a sense of balance. His sister's fate was no longer his burden, nor was her guilt his to absolve. His duty remained clear: to protect what was entrusted to him, to serve quietly, and to let time decide what justice or mercy would look like. In silence he found strength. The night was clear when James finally rolled the Shelby out of the garage, its headlights cutting across the gravel driveway. 4 months, the car had sat as a symbol of his grandfather's trust, but now it was ready to live again. James slid into the driver's seat, the leather firm but familiar, the faint scent of oil and steel lingering like memory itself. He turned the key and the engine roared awake, steady, powerful, alive. The sound alone sent a chill through him, as if his grandfather's voice had returned in mechanical form. Out on the open road, the Shelby surged forward with smooth precision, each gear shift resonating through James's chest. He remembered his grandfather's creed: check every bolt. Don't trust the shine. Keep yourself whole. The words echoed in rhythm with the rumble of the engine, reminding him that life, like a machine, required care, honesty, and vigilance. Wind rushed through the open window, carrying away the heaviness of the past months, leaving only freedom in its wake. 4 miles, James drove without destination, the lines of the road stretching endlessly ahead. He wasn't escaping anything nor chasing after something new. He was affirming who he had become. The Shelby wasn't just a car. It was a moving testament to patience, service, and resilience. And with every turn of the wheels, James felt the bond between past and present tighten, not as a burden, but as a source of strength guiding him forward. The cemetery was quiet, the kind of stillness that seemed to absorb every sound. James walked slowly along the gravel path, a single folded paper in his jacket pocket, Sophia's letter still sealed inside its envelope. He stopped at his grandfather's grave, the headstone simple yet dignified, etched with a name that had shaped his life more than any inheritance ever could. For a long moment, James simply stood there, hands in his pockets, breathing in the silence. Then he spoke. He told his grandfather that the garage was alive again, not as a warehouse for contracts or a family dispute, but as a place of service. Veterans came and went, their cars repaired, their burdens lightened, their stories shared over coffee and grease-stained workbenches. He told him about the Shelby, the way it ran like new, a symbol of trust and legacy. And he promised that as long as he lived, the garage would remain what it was always meant to be. A space where patience, honesty, and discipline created something greater than wealth. Kneeling, James placed his hand gently on the cool stone. He did not mention Sophia's letter. Not yet. That truth would come when the time was right. For now, it was enough to say that he had chosen a different path than revenge or bitterness. He had chosen to stay whole, to keep the work honest, and to measure victory not in dollars but in lives touched. As he stood and looked toward the horizon, James felt a calm certainty settle in his chest. This was the real victory, the one his grandfather had always wanted for him.